Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane, for all your hard work getting us started. So my name's Ben Raskin. I'm the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. I'm also project managing a 200-acre agroforestry project in Wiltshire, and I was one of the editors of the agroforestry handbook that came out last year. This session is delivered as part of the Welsh Agroforestry Learning Network, which is part of the Fabulous Farmers Interreg project, Fabulous, FAB standing for Functional Agricultural Biodiversity. So it's a multi-partner European project designed to support farmers in the transition to a more agroecological practice on their farms, and the project aims to increase on-farm efficiency and reduce reliance on external inputs by increasing this functional agricultural biodiversity. So thank you to them for funding it. So the upland farms are under a lot of pressure. Most, as you know, are highly reliant on income beyond just the sale of meat.
Ben, you've gone on mute.
Sorry, that was my fault.
I thought, oh, I'm already going on too long, am I? So yeah, so there's obviously this massive current uncertainty with Brexit and the reform of support payments looming. It makes planning future farm management strategies almost impossible, and yet we know the climate's in trouble, and farms have an important role to play in helping. The government, in theory, are committed to this big tree planting program, although I'm not entirely clear they've got a good idea of how that might be achieved. Policymakers often see the uplands, I think, as an easy win in terms of tree planting, where they think they can take what's perceived to be this less productive land out of farming to help them hit their big tree planting targets. And along with that, you get some of this high profile rewilding debates with people like George Monbiot and others, which risk polarizing, I think, that discussion on tree planting, even with echoes of the highland clearances of farmers removed from the landscape to make way for forest or for other benefits. So what we're hoping to do in this session is to try and take a bit of a middle ground here and explore how farmers might make better use of current tree stocks on farms, but also the opportunity to integrate more tree planting into the uplands to benefit existing farming enterprise and to improve productivity and resilience. We've got three great speakers, and as long as they all keep to time, we should have some time for questions at the end. But they might also have time to try and answer questions in the chat when they're not speaking. So we're going to start with Tim Pagella, who's going to set the scene for us before we dive a bit deeper into the productivity and animal welfare side with Lindsay Whistance, and then finally Gareth Davies is going to take us through some of the sort of more practical management and market and supply chain opportunities around trees on farms. So I'm going to hand over to Tim. A lot of you will know him. He's a systems scientist based at Bangor University, specializes in agroforestry systems and agroecology. His research focuses on the role that agroforestry plays in delivering both public goods and broader food security. And as well as working closely with farmers, Tim's a great advocate for agroforestry at a policy level, and was one of the authors of the handbook that I mentioned earlier. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Ben.
There we go.
Lovely. Okay, so today, as Ben said, I'm going to really sort of try and set the scene a little bit. And talk a little bit about how I perceive the value of trees, both historically and in the future, farming systems in Wales, and echoing quite a lot of the discussion that's happened earlier this morning, thinking about high nature value systems and this you know, the fact that we're going through a period of quite dramatic change within the systems. You can move on to the next slide, please, Ben. And it's change that I'm really interested in. We are going through, you know, a period of where the effects of climate change are now bite, and that those effects will intensify. We have Brexit looming in the background, or the effects of Brexit looming in the background, and we have COVID that we're dealing with recently. And so, you know, I think as I go through this talk, I really want to keep the process of change in our minds. And I'll start by just talking about the sort of obvious elephant in the room in some senses, which is the sort of potentially adversarial relationship that sometimes appears in our discussions around the role that woodlands have when they're interacting with agriculture. If we go back to the Neolithic periods when agriculture first started in the UK 6,000 years ago, we were often clearing woodland. We were clearing woodland to create space for agriculture, and that idea still persists in our minds, that we clear land, we clear space for agriculture. More recently, there have been periods where we had you know, problematic interactions between the agricultural sector and the Commission around some of the plantings in the 70s and beyond. And more recently still, there have been difficulties around trees and subsidy payments. So there are lots of reasons to see where conflicts have arisen in the past. But at the same time, if we look across the Welsh uplands landscape and across the Welsh farming in general, you'll see that trees are a persistent part of our agricultural systems. And agroforestry is effectively the study of these systems. And they all have lots of different names. Agroforestry is an umbrella term. And if I can go to the next slide, please, Ben. So we're really talking about agroforestry being the process where trees interact with agriculture. It's a very broad definition. And I always like to start these conversations by saying it started with the farmers. You know, we talked about this earlier. If we look at those early agricultural systems going back 6,000 years ago, you can see trees playing a prominent role. We've used, you know, pollarded trees to provide fodder, and trees have remained a persistent part of our agricultural systems right up to the present day. And if you look at a typical Welsh uplands landscape, you will see trees all over it. The hedgerow networks, the trees by our river systems, trees providing all sorts of functions on those farms. And the science, the reason we have this term agroforestry is basically scientists studying these farmer-developed systems and occasionally refining them to make them fit better in different contexts. But effectively, we're tracking farmer behavior. It's come from farmers first, and we build on that. And you know, what tends to happen as we go through these periods of change is that we see gradual shifts in our systems. I sometimes worry that agroforestry proposes something that's going to happen to your farm. It's often already there, and we're generally talking about making gentle changes to those systems to modify them to better fit with what's going on, or occasionally to diversify what we're doing in response to a change. And part of that's what we're going to look at in this talk. Have the next slide. So very crudely, I've got this image here just to show almost two sides of agroforestry, but I've called it forestry and agroforestry here. If you look at the image on the left-hand side, this is what my colleagues in Bangor, who are the foresters, will be studying, is how we produce high-quality timber and thinking about some of the benefits from doing so. So very much a focus on what's happening in the trunk, and increasingly also thinking about the carbon sequestration role that those forests can play. But really, you know, this crude comparison is really here to sort of emphasize what the differences are from my discipline, which is agroforestry, which is where we're, although we recognize the value of the timber component, it's probably not our primary focus, and nor is it necessarily the primary focus of the farmers who are using the trees. We're often much more interested in what's happening in relation to the canopy. You know, we're looking about the shelter value of those things, or some of the products that can be driven from the canopy, be it fodder or fruits or other benefits. And we are very heavily focused on what's happening below ground in relation to the way that trees interact with the soil, both in terms of the way they mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also looking at the mycorrhizal associations, the ability to fix nitrogen, all of these other benefits that are happening below ground, which provide added benefits to the system. And if we're thinking about agroforestry, these two systems here actually represent two choices that we have at various levels in relation to making decisions about agroforestry on farm. Could I go on to the next slide, please? So you've got basically two choices, crude choices, and of course they're not discrete choices, they're a spectrum. The first sort of focus on agroforestry's diversification option. And that image in the middle there is showing a set of neatly arranged ash trees in Northern Ireland, which are being grown in a pasture. But the trees are being managed for their timber value, so that they're being high pruned, they're being managed so that they produce a final product, a crop. On the right-hand side, we've got what I call the little helper role that trees play on farm, and probably more of a focus for me. And that's in putting tree infrastructure in place that provides benefits to the farming system by supporting the activities that the farmers are seeking to do. So this is a shelter belt, and the primary aim there is to provide shelter to the stock to enhance their capacity to grow. Okay, now on any given farm, you can have both these systems in play. In fact, you can that particular shelter belt, there is timber within it. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but of course, the way that we design those systems will probably look to gain one more prominent than the other. And of course, if you are removing those trees in the first picture from the land, then you lose some of that shelter value for periods of time. So we have to think quite carefully about what we want and how we design to fix it. Next slide, please. So in Wales, we're interested in, and I apologize to the translators for the jargon, we're looking primarily at silvo pastoral systems, so silvo trees and pasture. We don't have a great amount of land that's suitable for arable farming, although that will probably change as we go forward as the climate changes. But silvo pasture is really looking at the role that trees play with livestock, be they in open fields by adding trees or the introduction of stock into wooded areas. And it ranges from terms that we're all familiar with: hedgerows, shelter belts, and farm woodlands. And again, the functions, you can have both. You can either be looking at those helping functions, or you can be looking at those provisioning functions, and we see both forms present in Wales. It's the most common form of silvopasture in the UK. There's only been one study that's looked at this, and that gives us a total figure for all of the UK, and we don't have any individual data for Wales. But I would also hazard a guess that of the approximately just under 15% of the total land cover of Wales, which is woodland, we know a third of that is farm woodland. And we have almost a third again of tree cover outside of woodland, much of which is in the countryside, which would lead me to roughly estimate that almost half of the tree cover in Wales could be defined as agroforestry systems of one form or another. Could I have the next slide? So the principal thing we're wanting from these systems, certainly from a shelter benefit, is getting the energy balance right for our stock. We know that if we put trees or hedgerow systems in the right place, then they help to protect our stock from the extremes of weather. And of course, under a climate change scenario, these extremes are increasing, and so these problems are starting to manifest more prominently. And we don't have to go too far back into our recent past to see quite large levels of livestock mortality rates associated with blasts from the north creating stock damage. So agroforestry is potentially an adaptation strategy that we can use to try and mitigate or limit some of these impacts. If I go on to the next slide. So shelter belt works in a very simple way. Basically what we're using is vegetation cover which is hopefully porous, allows the wind to pass through it, because that gives it, what that does is slow the wind through the stock and creates a sort of a wind shadow behind the trees. So you have this vertical barrier, and you can build this up depending on your context and your design. So it can start with just a simple hedgerow, but if you need more shelter, you can, or you want to sort of broaden the suite of benefits that it can provide, you can give more land over to the shelter belt and increase the area of effect. Okay, so you can have different combinations, and what we know is that this will give live weight gains, so your stock will grow more because it's less stress. It's putting less of its energy into keeping itself warm, or keeping itself cool if we're talking about sun. But also, at critical points in the year, particularly around lambing, we tend to see very, very high lambing mortality rates if you're outdoor lambing in the winter, and you can see significant drops in those rates if the trees have access to good shelter infrastructure. So there are lots of reasons why we can think about promoting shelter belt systems for farmers and increasing the cover of land we have to provide these little helper functions that trees can provide. Could I have the next slide, please? Of course, trees can provide a lot more than that at the same time. So as well as providing the shelter, they will still be doing, they can be helping to prevent erosion or soil loss on the farm. They can be providing timber within those shelter belt systems as trees are growing, they're producing a potential crop. They can provide shade provision, reduce pest incidents. So they are all providing benefits, potential benefits on farms. At the same time, the combinations of trees across the farm can provide benefits that leak off the farm and provide public goods elsewhere. And I've sort of listed them against all these potential benefits. So you've got things like water regulation, but in reality, we were always managing our farms in Wales with our heavy soils. In many cases, we're managing them for water anyway. You drive your vehicles along hedgerows because we know that the hedgerow system dries out the soil and prevents erosion poaching from occurring in those systems. Combinations of trees provide those benefits leak off the farm. That's the wrong word to use in this particular context, but then potentially provide flood risk benefits. Can I have to quickly go on to the next, just trigger this arrow? And as the science and study emerges, we can learn how different things about the system also feed into that. So, for example, we're aware that farming systems are a big contributor to climate change. But looking at what we can do with tree fodder, we can see that tree fodder can suppress some of the methogenic bacteria within the livestock gut. And so, we're at Bangor, we're studying at the moment alongside other universities, looking at the way that tree fodder can help to reduce the amount of methane being produced by livestock. And so these then feed into systems going forward. Can I have the next slide, please? It is important to think about the off-farm benefits as well, because I suspect that's increasingly what policy is also interested alongside the benefits on farm. So all of those benefits that do leak off the farm are important, and they're important also in relation to thinking about what's happening to us in the future as climate change starts to bite. So there's been a lot of interest looking at climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And enhancing sustainable intensification across the UK and certainly globally now. Agroforestry has gone away from being a very niche subject area to being a pretty mainstream climate mitigation strategy. And that's partly because trees are so inherently multifunctional. They produce these multiple benefits, so we can shape those benefits or prioritize those benefits. But on the whole, the addition of trees onto the landscape produce benefits and goods that have often been lost as we've converted land to agriculture in the past. So often this is about bringing those systems back and building on sort of those regenerative functions that one of the speakers was talking about earlier. And of course, we've also talked about the water this morning. Flood risk is increasing. It's a challenge every year now, as are droughts. So both the absence of water and the too much water are all things that we can potentially use trees to manage, and the location for doing that is on agricultural systems. And of course, we talked about COVID. Similarly, it's not too far in our distant past when we're thinking about foot and mouth. Things like biosecurity can have devastating effects, and again, you can use trees very carefully on land to provide those benefits in certain parts of the farm. Next slide, please. I don't want to talk too much about agroecology, but agroforestry is a central component of agroecological thinking. The slide is here in some senses because we were talking about nature-based farming earlier, and agroecology is an element of that. It's a mechanism by which we can achieve that moving forward. I don't call these conservation-based systems, what they are is ecologically based systems. We're moving into different contexts. We can't always be looking backwards, but we can use that ecology to future-proof our farming systems and start to build these regenerative strategies to keep the soil and manage the soil for the future. So, agroforestry is a tool for agroecology and is designed to build farm resilience and to prepare our farms for the future using these regenerative ecological principles. Next slide, please. And if you look at how that might play out, there are all sorts of different strategies that we can use. And a lot of work in the past has gone on to designing different forms of system. And I guess increasingly what we're focusing on now from a researcher point of view is not so much the design of these different things, but actually trying to understand better how to get the right design into the right place. It's not the right tree into the right place, but it's the right system that works both for the farmer to meet the needs of the farmer, but also that can provide these broader benefits alongside those things. And of course that varies depending on where we are. We can take what they talk about as a land sharing or land sparing approach. So land sharing approach is where we're looking for this multifunctionality everywhere. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can have trees everywhere in regular spacings or irregular spacings, but just have low densities of trees everywhere. Or you can sort of compact trees into various parts of the farm where they work well to provide specific benefits. Or you can take a more extreme view and spare some farms completely from having trees on the land and concentrate others into woodland areas. And agroforestry will actually play out across all of those systems in some senses. We're grazing quite a lot of our woodlands, or we can use different elements of these things. But have the next slide, please.
2 minutes, Tim, just to let you know.
Thank you. Click it on again. Yeah, so basically what we're looking at here is what I call adaptation or transformation strategies. Given that we're in a time of change, what often we're looking for is we've got areas of pasture, converting them to still pasture by adding a few trees allows us to retain that function. The conversion of pasture to woodland is a shift into a different function, so we call that a transformation. It's a more extreme thing. Some of these options will work on some parts of the farm, may not work on other parts of the farm. Some of these options will work for some farms and not for others. So there's no one size fits all generic approach for agriculture. We need to work out and fit and design big context. Next slide, Ben. Is that moving? Or have we frozen? So just because I've got very little time, I'm talking about, so just very quickly thinking about the sort of broader economic values. So in the first two strategy, I was talking about the sort of diversification option where we focus on products that can be produced through agroforestry, or the sort of little helper options. So, I mean, there's been lots of work recently being done on biomass production, firewood and timber potentially. These are potentially destructive uses, and certainly it leaves you without tree cover at certain periods of time. But these are important diversification models. They require good management of trees and connection to the value chains. If we look at the other forms, little helper forms, you've got the rising carbon markets, which of course can be using timber as well, and delivery of public goods, which don't often have mature markets at present, but they do combine probably more easily with that little helper function. Both strategies, of course, have merits depending on your farming context and how well you're situated within value chains, but we need to value the costs and benefits and our understanding. Next slide. I'm not going to spend too long on this. I guess the important thing from my point of view is that I would encourage you to think about the trees that you do have on farm, what they're doing, whether they're working to the best of their ability. I talked about having a high area of Wales under tree cover. A lot of that isn't functioning to the best of its ability. So I think how we can modify those things and how feasible it is to address these things, but also encouraging you to think about the future and the challenges that we face, how we might want to future-proof our farms going forward, and whether trees might have a role in that. Final slide, if I can, please. Well, it's not popping up for me, but I can do it from memory. I guess my key points that I wanted to make are that agroforestry is a funny term. I don't want anybody to sort of fixate on that. It's just a name for a number of different practices, which all involve trees on land. It's a really common feature in our landscape. It's not something new. It's something that's already there. We just need to think about how to maybe manage it better. And if we're expanding it, to think carefully about what we want from those systems. If we do expand it, We do know from work done in the UK, but across the world, that it can mitigate many of the negative externalities, if I can use that word, of agriculture, and can provide off-farm and on-farm benefit if we can get the design right and fit those designs properly to the context. We probably need some help with that. We've got a lot of experience in Wales compared to other parts of the UK. Organisations like Coed Cymru, Farming Connect, the Soil Association, Woodland Trust are all there to feed in advice, but we need to expand and build on that in the future if we want to see more of this type of thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was great. Sorry that my slides there seems to be a bit of a lag occasionally, so I hope they're coming through eventually. I think what we'll do is we'll crack on with Lindsay's presentation. So save up questions, I think, until the end. There was one already that's come through around support payments for grazing and the apparent reluctance of the Welsh Government to support trees. So if you maybe bear that in mind for the discussion at the end. But in the meantime, let me introduce you to Lindsay. So Lindsay is a researcher at the Organic Research Centre. She's senior livestock researcher. She's been working in animal behaviour, health and welfare since 2003, and her specific interests include the human-animal relationships and the role that diverse species-rich environments play in offering good welfare conditions, as well as food and medicine for domestic animals. Lindsay was another of the contributors to the handbook, and we're now going to benefit from her deep understanding of really how animals and trees interact. So let me hand over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so as Ben says, I'm going to be focusing on trees, but how the presence of trees can benefit animals in multiple ways. And this includes temperature regulation, body maintenance, and social behaviour. They're also going to be talking about productivity, but the productivity I'm going to be focusing on is that which comes about as a natural consequence of providing good welfare. Next, please. Thanks. So in terms of body maintenance, when we have livestock and silvopasture systems, they show less aggression towards each other and less fear towards humans than when they're kept on open pasture. In cattle in particular, social behaviour is more cohesive. They tend to stay closer together, and social licking, which is a very positive social interaction, if we take this as a proportion of all social interactions, it's almost twice that of cows on open pasture. So nearly 80% of their social interactions now comprise of positive social licking behaviour. In terms of being less fearful towards humans, this at least is partly attributed to them having something physical to hide behind. Next slide, please. So a healthy coat and healthy skin act as a really important frontline defence against disease. And all animals, regardless of their species, spend part of every single day managing this through licking or preening or rubbing their coat. And access to trees and shrubs at a variety of angles can enable them to access pretty much most body parts. And let me just say, if people are wondering why poultry, the cockerel is there up in the left-hand corner, of course they don't use trees for rubbing, but they do show a lot more preening behaviour when they're given canopies, the protection of canopies to live under. So really through rubbing, livestock can remove dead skin and dead hair, and they can also remove seeds that can penetrate the skin, and as well as external parasites such as ticks. And the rubbing behaviour can also act as an early warning, really, of parasites that can't be managed easily, or fly strike, which causes the sheep to itch quite a lot. Okay, next slide, please. So the buffering of temperatures in winter and summer is important for livestock at a landscape level, not just as at an animal level. So here we've got an image of the only green grass available is under the apple tree in this photograph from summer. This is Wiltshire 2018. And then we've got an increase in temperature below. You can see the only available grass for the sheep is under this downy birch. And here we can see how the temperature can increase, which can be up to 6 degrees centigrade under tree canopy, even without the presence of leaves. So the picture on the right-hand side is a system that Tim also referred to in Ireland. So these ash trees, although they're primarily grown for timber, they've improved water management to such a degree that the presence of them have extended the grazing season by a full 17 weeks, and 5 of those weeks in spring. And of course, the buffering of the winter temperatures enables livestock to find themselves a warmer resting place when they're outwintered. Next, please. So if we consider shelter from cold conditions, well, trees offer good protection from rain, wind, and cold. Now, animals have both a higher and a lower critical temperature. Outside of these temperatures, there's an increasing risk to health and welfare, and this begins with the mobilization of energy to maintain corporate temperature. For beef cattle, if we take them as an example, the general rule of thumb is that for every 1 degree drop below their lower critical temperature, there's a 2% increase in energy requirements. For these cattle that have developed a normal winter coat, which is also dry, the lower critical temperature will be about 0 degrees. But then if we add wind into this mix, so if we take an example of an air temperature of 2 degrees, and then we add a cold wind that is blowing at 16 miles per hour, the effective temperature now becomes -7. So for this animal, still with a dry coat, it now requires 14% more feed just to break even. If we then add rain into this mix, the lower critical temperature shoots up to 15.5 degrees. So in this scenario, it's wet and it's windy. These animals now require 45% extra feed just to break even. Next slide, please. So Tim talked about 150,000 sheep dying in Wales in a single winter. Well, here's an example of sheep being culled in summer conditions. If we now consider a newly shorn sheep, its lower critical temperature is a whopping 28 degrees. If we take an average temperature of 16 degrees, the required extra feed for that animal will now be 20%. And then, of course, we get further substantial increases with wind and rain. And although fleece grows quickly, the changing climate is bringing more changeable weather patterns with it, so that adverse conditions in summer also become more likely. And you can see in this image, these Wiltshire horns are unable to find reasonable shelter. And they're no longer engaged with their own life, if you like, they're just coping. Okay, next slide, please. So as Tim also mentioned, exposure to cold is one of the biggest causes of lamb losses in outdoor lambing systems. I have a more conservative 30% reduction in losses of lambs. But of course, you know, we take our learning from around the world and different systems. And overall, whether it's 30% or 50%, that's a lot of lambs being lost due to poor welfare. And the reason that there is such a high loss of lambs is that really they have very, very limited body reserves to compensate for cold stress. And they're coming out wet, so they're already in a very vulnerable condition. And their heat loss can be as much as 10 degrees in the first 30 minutes of life. And so combined with starvation, this is the reason why so many lambs are lost at birth. Next, please. And then we also have to think that ewes have different needs to their lambs. And even if you provide shelter, if they have to travel too far to find food and water, they will leave the shelter and they will take the lambs with them. So it's really important that if you want the best out of the shelter that you can offer, that you position feed and water close to the shelter, and also to provide sufficient shelter so that there is a reduction in overcrowding, or you avoid the risk of overcrowding and the subsequent mismothering. And in this way, encouraging ewes to remain at the sheltered birth site for as long as possible helps to strengthen ewe-lamb bonds and therefore lamb survival to weaning. So we consider for singles, the ewe-lamb bond is strong after a single day, when they can both recognise visually and vocally their mother. But for twins and triplets, it can take up to 3 days. And then, of course, it's unsurprising that lambs that grow with shelter are expending less energy on maintaining body heat, and so have much higher growth rates than lambs without shelter. And this has been measured up to 21%. Next, please. So this is an actual example of a sheep farmer who farms up in the Cairngorms, and he utilises trees in 2 different ways. So he's got a belt of commercial evergreens that were planted by his uncle, and he uses these as a living barn at lambing time. And this shelter has both increased lamb survival, but has also cut feed bills for the ewes. He's then gone on and planted the rows of trees that you can see at the bottom. And the primary goal for this is to grow good grass early in the season for his lactating ewes, as well as providing shelter for the growing lambs. Now, what this has meant for him in his system is that he's been able to change his breed from Scottish Blackfaces. He now farms cleans with Texel pups, produces a much more commercially viable lamb with fewer inputs and higher welfare for his sheep. Next, please. Yeah, so if we flip to the other end of the season and we talk about heat stress and shade, well, still, as important as managing cold conditions is, on a global level, shade is the single most important benefit that trees provide for animals. So heat stress happens when an animal's heat load is greater than its capacity to lose heat. And when they begin to experience heat stress, the natural thing for them to do is to seek shade. For cattle, this begins at about 18 degrees, and this depends on things such as coat colour, production status, skin colour, other things. Now, animals can suffer and recover from mild heat stress, and they do this during the cooler periods, such as at night time, but they nevertheless reduce their feed intake whilst they are suffering from the heat stress. And of course, this negatively impacts on production, and milk yield has been measured at around 3 litres less per day. When heat stress increases, you get a movement of blood. So it's redirected from non-vital systems and out to the skin where it can be cooled. And these non-vital systems include the reproductive tract, so that conception and embryonic development and growth are compromised. And it also includes the gut, where up to 50% of blood servicing this system is redirected towards body cooling. The consequence of redirecting so much blood is that the gut membrane becomes permeable, and then is no longer able to prevent endotoxins and mycotoxins entering into the bloodstream, and this can trigger inflammation cascades. So it's probably no surprise to learn that dairy cows without shade have significantly higher levels of mastitis than those with access to shade. This was a study carried out in Italy with over 3,000 dairy cows. So overall, with higher disease levels, compromised production through slower growth rates and lower yields, as well as poorer reproduction rates, the annual costs of heat stress to the US dairy industry have been calculated to be in excess of $900 million. And for the beef industry, it's over $400 million. Next slide, please. If we then consider what shade does bring, well, in good silvopasture systems, solar radiation can be reduced by around 58% compared to open pasture, and the skin temperature of livestock has been measured at 4 degrees lower when they have access to shade. And under these more benign conditions, they maintain their normal behaviour patterns, and importantly for production, grazing activity is maintained. And this has been shown for cattle in Texas. For example, they reach their target weights a full 20 days earlier than steers without shade. And another thing this does is that animals with access to shade, they tend to utilise their landscape and the resources within it more evenly. So that you also then get a more even spread of the recycled nutrients, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And it's worth mentioning that overall, not including timber, silvopasture produces more forage per unit area than pasture alone. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, Lindsay.
So if we now consider trees as a feed source, well, pretty much all domestic animals eat browse, and this includes poultry and monogastrics. If we're talking about direct browse, then we need to consider access, so understanding browse heights. For sheep, it's around 1.2 metres. For cattle, it's 2 metres. And for goats, it's non-existent. They're termed vertical browsers. They'll pretty much climb anything they can. Next slide, please. So the average diet of all domestic livestock includes grasses, forbs, and browse. And forbs, if you like, is everything that's not grass in a pasture, put it very simply. But on average, over a year, cattle eat about 12% from trees, total diet. For sheep, it's around 20%, and for goats, this is up to 60%. And then there are periods of time where that increases quite dramatically, and that might be in drought conditions where grass availability is very low. It might also be in spring conditions where palatability is very high. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into detail with this slide, but I show it just to indicate that overall the nutritional benefits of tree fodder are highly comparable to those from grasses grown in the same environment. Next, please. Now, sourcing good protein for animal feed is a global issue, and this is a more up-to-date study looking at protein content. And we can see that the crude and degradable protein levels in tree leaves, and particularly ash, lime, and outstandingly mulberry, they compare very well with levels found in alfalfa and ryegrass. But what the grasses don't contain is condensed tannins. And although the primary role of condensed tannins is to inhibit normal digestion of protein in the rumen, actually having up to 5% of dry matter as condensed tannins is really beneficial. And the bonds that prevent the proteins breaking down in the rumen then become broken down in the more acidic abomasum, really effectively delivering good quality rumen bypass protein. And another benefit of having condensed tannins in the diet is the reduction of methane. So the methane produced from willow is less than half that from lucerne. Next slide, please. Another thing that trees do is provide a very good source of micronutrients and particularly minerals. And these have been found to be higher in dried fodder compared to fresh. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples. We have goat willow, a very good source of calcium and phosphorus in a very handy 2-to-1 ratio. That's Salix caprea. And then we have osier willow, the Salix viminalis, a really very good source of zinc, which plays an important role in many biological functions, skin integrity, promoting the efficient metabolism of protein and carbohydrates. And then I've just highlighted in red the total nitrogen in the alder. Technically, it's a good source of nutrients, but it's really quite unattractive as a feed source. But this level of nitrogen reflects its superior nitrogen fixing properties. Next slide, please. So the Woodland Grazing Toolbox have developed this palatability scale with some comments about the ranking of some trees such as hawthorn. And I just want to make an important point here that palatability is not simply defined by the taste of something, but instead it's the interrelationship between the senses, primarily taste, and feedback from post-ingestion processes. And so this post-ingestive feedback effectively calibrates this hedonistic sensation and regulates whether something is eaten and in what amounts. So for example, lambs deficient in vitamin E in a trial moved to a less palatable feed that was high in vitamin E until balance was regained, and then they moved back to the more palatable feed. And in this study, the authors noted that the lamb's internal feedback system was sufficiently sensitive for them to seek out the novel feed with the required nutrient before any clinical symptoms emerged or could be measured. Next slide, please. So trees can also play a part in rectifying nutritional imbalances in medicine. So the ability of animals to self-regulate intake is often discussed, but there is an increasing body of evidence that supports that the balancing of nutrients each day is an ability that they do have. So rather than trying to balance nutrients at each meal, it's across the day. Yeah, I've lost my, I don't know if that slide is still available. Anyhow, I don't know if you managed to catch the image, but there was a really quite grotesque image of a steer with a dead rabbit in its mouth. Now, these are animals that are kept on moorland, which is a very phosphorus poor environment, and have not been offered sufficient mineral supplementation.
And we seem to have lost the slides.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It suddenly went blank. I'm just trying to get it back. Sorry. Keep talking.
Okay, it kind of loses its impact without the image, but I'll keep going.
I know. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
That one. Yeah.
Is that better? Is that back?
No, next one up.
The one up.
Yeah. That one.
There we go.
Yeah.
That better.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's this fairly grotesque image. Yeah, but I mean, it's important to recognise that this animal has sought out the nutrient it needs, even if it is from a really abnormal source. It recognises that it can, well, that it has the potential to find that source, and that it understands that it can rebalance its needs through food sources. But perhaps if we think back to the minerals, then a few goat willows would be a much kinder provision in this environment. The other thing to say here is pain management. Well, salicylic acid is something perhaps that we all know and understand as the precursor to our aspirin. But as well as painkiller properties, it also has antibiotic, antipyretic, anti-inflammatory and fungicidal properties. And there was a study carried out when ewes were offered 2 different varieties of willow to browse on, one with a particularly high level of salicylic acid, one with much lower, and they all chose to browse on the high salicylic acid variety. Now, it's not known why they chose to do this, but it does demonstrate that they could tell the difference. And then finally, if we consider condensed tannins once again, well, they've been shown to help manage internal parasite burdens by reducing both the number and the size of maturing larvae so that fewer eggs are also produced for the next generation. And sheep with high worm burdens switch to eating plants with condensed tannins, and in this way they can reduce their burden by up to 50%. Okay, last slide, please. So really, putting trees into an animal's environment brings diversity, and it offers animals valid choices to maintain better social relations, better body health, nutritional health, and comfort, fulfilling good welfare, animal welfare ideals. Now, assuming that the animals in these conditions have appropriate genetics, then the buffering that is provided will also enable them to fulfill their genetic potential so that yield and product quality is not then lost to poor welfare. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Lindsay. So we'll move on to Gareth, who's the director of Coed Cymru, who are planting and managing woodlands on farms across Wales. They currently have rural development plan projects aiming at improving woodland management and increasing routes to market and broadleaf woodland restoration. And Coed Cymru, I think, have pioneered in a way recognising the value of farm woodland in Wales, and we certainly look rather enviously across the border from England and wish we had a Coed England. And Gareth has been with them for many years, and I think he's well known and respected in the farming community. And under his leadership, Coed Cymru have significantly increased their work with farmers to help realise the benefits and value of existing farm woodlands. So over to you, Gareth.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
okay,
I can,
great.
yes.
Great, okay. Well, you've introduced us really well, so I'll skip that slide, but we basically plant and manage woodland in Wales. Most of our clients are farmers. I'm just going to, Tim touched on this, I'll just very quickly go through these slides. The importance of the kind of woodland that we might consider agroforestry woodland. So I'm just going to talk about what we do. This isn't really particularly academic, this is what we do day in, day out, every day. So if you look at the composition of woodland in Wales, at least a third of it's ancient semi-natural woodland, it's broadleaf woodland, and a lot of this woodland is found on farms. And if you look at the overall statistics, quite a bit of conifer woodland as well on farms, but the broadleaf woodland, the iconic woodland that we have in Wales, is predominantly part of farm business. So in terms of agroforestry, we are looking after woodland that's already there, and we are creating new woodland, again, mostly on farmland. So a third of the woodland in Wales is what I'm going to talk about here. So if we go on the next slide, please. And we focus on both, as I said, management of existing, but also creating new woodland. And it's all about integration for us between woodland, forestry and farming, particularly in the current economic climate. On the next slide, hang on, I got a funny message that's come up right in the middle of my screen. Sorry. So this is typically what we deal with day in, day out. So I don't know how well you can see that, but it demonstrates this is the sort of thing that we do. You've got parcels of woodland and they're quite dispersed across the landscape. We've got different things. These are 2 or 3 farms, neighbouring farms that have got different things, new planting, woodland to possibly some conifer, clear fell and replant, possibly some conifer thinning, some broadleaf thinning, and a whole range of options there. And this is typically what we manage. And when you put that together, I guess at a landscape level, you start to look at sort of payment, you know, ecosystem services and flood risk provision, timber production, and what that means. So I'm just going to talk about what that means to us for the next 5 or 10 minutes, just give you an idea. So on the next slide, this is just a list of public and private goods. This is the sort of way Welsh Government are approaching this at the moment. And yeah, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but for us, it's about the scale at which you achieve these. So water benefit, Tim touched on this, gives some really good examples. If you're planting trees for water, you really need to do that across more than one farm. If, you know, we're looking to seriously address our carbon targets, for example, you know, we need to be having the scale of woodland planting, and we are seeing the budgets now coming from Welsh Government, and these schemes are coming through. And I think we're at a really exciting point, you know, in terms of agroforestry and farmers engaging with woodland, because, you know, in Wales now we are really demonstrating that the scale is there, and a number of schemes, you know, for planting and management are coming through, and it's starting to be significant. So on the next slide, I tried to put a summary of, for us, what agroforestry might mean in our context. But this is really just what we do, do day in, day out. For new woodland, Tim touched on this, land sparing and land sharing, how you use both in different contexts. And it's, for us, planting, we're either converting whole field parcels typically to woodland and forestry options, or we're planting trees alongside continued agricultural production, grazing, etc. We do one or the other or both, typically on farms. But for us, we don't acquire land to plant trees. You know, we deliver our objectives through farmers. So for us, it's really about guiding the farmers to make the decisions where they might plant trees. We're not looking at whole farm conversion. It's usually field parcel conversion max. And our model really does rely on farmers continuing to farm. And I think there's a good, I think if I've got this correct, on the next slide, Ben, there's a good example of this. You know, we look at a landscape like this. How do you make the decision in that context? This is just a typical slide in upland Wales. Where would you plant the trees to optimize the land use? And I would argue in a lot of those situations, it's the farmers that are one of the best placed people to make that decision about the optimum land use, because they're already gaining the economic value from farming. So the balance between, if you look at pure economics, between forestry and farming, the farmers are in a really good position to do that because they can maximize both with the right advice and guidance. A lot of what we do is provide access to market. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of this next slide on here now is a really good example. I show this one a lot. This is actually from the Pontbrem catchment, but we're doing this pretty much everywhere. This is trees and forestry option that is really a part of that farmer's livestock handling system, because he can bring the stock down from the hill. He's designed that in such a way that it provides shelter, it provides some biosecurity, actually, we talked about in the last presentation, but also he can get those sheep and deal with them. He's got a hard standing area, and it's buffering the stream, which you can't see just below. So we do lots of things like that. But also on the next two slides, I think you can just flick through the next two, if I got it right. This is whole field parcel conversion of land, where we're seeing more and more field parcels coming out of production for livestock, but farmers are looking at trees and woodlands instead. And I'll just talk a bit about the drivers for that. So on the next slide, I wanted just to make the point that these, you know, we are primarily an environmental organisation, really, and these woodland creation schemes, there's a very rigorous process that these go through. in terms of environmental constraints. So this isn't about planting trees on every piece of land. There's quite a significant process that goes through, certainly with the bigger schemes, to make sure that they're compatible with other habitat as well. And we've got a long record of doing that. On the next slide, one of the things that we're taking account of now quite a lot is climate change. And Tim again alluded to this. And this is something where you look at, Welsh Government have a land classification map, which is on flare.gov.uk. This is really interesting. And what we're taking account of now is how the land might change in terms of productivity grade 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. is quite interesting. And of course, with woodland and forestry, we need to be thinking about that now. So the opportunity space, as we see it, the schemes that are coming to us, are really in the grade 3B, the lower end of the improved land spectrum. So that's really the focus for us at the moment. And then if we go on to the next slide, a lot of what we do, I guess, as an organisation is enabling farmers to realise, or any woodland owners really, but as I said, primarily farmers, realising the economic value from these schemes. If you just, that slide we showed earlier with the woodland dispersed across the landscape, is how do we make that economic really to manage? And I mean economic in the widest sense, really, about useful things, not purely about return on investment. And we tend to find that's really what farmers are driven towards as well. And really for us, it's about new and existing, and it's very mixed woodland and forestry with high ecosystem service values. And for us, it's about creating scale and managing these group models. And that's what we're very focused on now. So I think agroforestry, if we're going to take that forward as a term, I mean, it's kind of what we do anyway, I think, but we need a different economic model as well to that that's used by contemporary forestry investment. Timber, we do a lot of timber harvesting actually, but the carbon and ecosystem services is a huge opportunity and a step towards that. And for us, what we're really focused on, we're not a huge conifer management company, that's not what we do. We're really focused on what we think of as the iconic woodlands in Wales, the broadleaf woodlands, and we're very focused on creating more of that, but also managing what we've got. And I'll just give a couple of examples about what economic means for us, really. So these are slides. We do quite a lot of presentations to farmers in Wales through Farming Connect, for example, and these are the kinds of messages that we try and put across. So, you know, making useful products from thinnings from your woodlands. This is really valuable to a farm because fence post quality is not always the best. And you know, we have a lot of customers that actually make their own fence posts with machinery like this. They're relatively inexpensive. Clefting stakes, if you've got the right material, that's actually quite quick and efficient to do. Done plenty of that. So these are actually economic outcomes in the context of agroforestry, which are very valuable to the farm. And on the next slide, I think, yeah, we've got, for us, forestry machinery typically is very big now. You know, we're talking machines 25, 30 tons or more. So a lot of what we do that kind of forestry at times, but a lot of what we do is this kind of scale, tractor scale. And, you know, this is a farm tractor with a winch on it, but, you know, it's using machinery like this and trying to keep that, the technology at that scale up to date and having equipment of the right scale for the sorts of jobs that we do. So that's sort of typically what we do day in, day out. The next slide, again, I put this in, intend to read this out here, but these are the sorts of messages that we give to farmers. So, you know, it's about being clear about what economic management means to you. You're growing a timber for a market, you know, all these sorts of things. How can you start? What do you need to think about when you're making the decision to plan to manage woodland on your farm? So these are the sorts of things we tend to go through with farmers day in, day out, and it echoes quite a lot of what Tim said actually earlier. And then really, the next slide, I can come back to any of those in the questions if necessary, but what we're seeing at the moment, carbon is a huge driver now. Even in the last 6 months, for us, it's quite interesting because we were in carbon pretty much first in Wales. As our schemes are one of the first to go through and be valued. So, and what it's seeing for us is a more of a diversity, I think, in income, lowering risk. But also, I think we're seeing more mixed woodland as a result of it being created. It's only for new woodland at the moment. But I think this is a real opportunity in terms of agroforestry because, you know, I think it's something the farmers really do buy into. So we're seeing a shift, I think, now with the carbon and the prices are going up, and it's driving a shift in the way that we think about woodland and forestry in Wales, certainly from an economic point of view. And that's, I think all the key messages, I just run through that very quickly because I can see we're short on time, but that's, you know, basically we're here to help. I think the next slide, yeah, that's just a clip of our website. So just a run through of what we do, really. Hope that was useful.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gareth. Right, we've got a few minutes for questions. There's been some really interesting comments as well on the chat. So I think if we answer, because we're all fresh with your talk, Gareth, if we could give you the question to Gareth first and then come back to the one earlier about tree fodder. So to what extent is it important to create wildlife corridors with connected forested areas? Also, this is more of a woodland management question, but is selective logging a practice used in Wales? I was recently in the north and was surprised to see so many clear-cut sides and mountains. So I guess that's for Gareth or anyone else that feels they have a view.
Well, shall I just give a quick answer? Yeah, we do a lot of connectivity, and the map, I showed a map very briefly with different colours on it. It's like a green map. And that is Welsh Government's scoring system, and one of the layers is quite high priority is connectivity. So we do quite a lot of that actually, and also with management of existing woodland. That's quite important. And we do a lot of selective logging. I'm assuming you're talking about continuous cover. We do a lot. You'll see a lot of clear cut going on at the moment because I think the timber price is high, and you know, that does have an impact on commercial forestry. But also there's a lot of larch being removed, and it's quite a shame, but a lot of people are having notices from NRW to remove larch because of Phytophthora disease. So you're probably going to see more clear cut than you normally would around at the moment.
Great, thank you. So the question about fodder was from Jane, and it was an interesting one, I thought. So is there a difference in the use of tree fodder, so self-medication perhaps, between native and imported breeds, or because you could possibly term them modern breeds, I guess, or do they all learn pretty quickly what's good for them?
Yeah, sorry, so is the question about the breed or the tree?
I think it seems to be I mean, we can maybe unmute Jane Ricketts-Hine if we need to, but I think the question was about whether different breeds learn or behave differently in terms of eating different species, self-medicating. Yes, the breed.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jane. Yeah, I mean, really, domesticated animals are very similar to their wild counterparts. So when we talk about behaviour, we don't really talk about a qualitative change in behaviour, it's more a quantitative change. So all the behaviour patterns in the wild animal are represented in the domesticated animal, and that goes across breeds. So whilst there might be some breeds, for example, the Shropshire sheep is gaining some reputation for browsing less than other breeds. They still do browse. So I don't think it's so much to do with whether they're foreign or not, but really whether the tree is foreign to the animal. So a lot of what animals eat has got much to do with learning. So familiarity with what is present. And learning really comes about first and foremost through the mother. So the flavours that are coming through to the fetus, the flavours that are coming through the milk, and then watching and doing what mother does is really the primary reason for animals eating what they do eat. And then you've got peer-to-peer learning, which is really strong also. And finally, you've got learning over time. And this is the most risky thing. And if we talk about livestock, they're actually quite risk averse because the consequences of getting it wrong can be really high. So they have a general fear of unknown things. And so having to learn from scratch is the slowest process. And there may be some breed differences in that, but largely it's a strategy, if you like, an evolutionary strategy that's kept them alive, and they retain that strategy. I hope that answers the question.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So I guess maybe one final question, which reflects some of the questions that came up during Tim's talk, was, how do we overcome this reluctance of the Welsh Government to support trees, individual trees, hedges, copses, and are there barriers, for instance, in the glass-tier that we can remove quite quickly and easily, or are there sort of bigger things that need to happen? Tim, do you want to start on that one?
I can very quickly. I think it's difficult. I mean, for me, I've been studying agroforestry for 20 odd years. One of the things that you tend to notice is it's not really owned by forestry, nor is it owned by agriculture, which is where the policy sits within those different silos, and agroforestry tends to fall in between. And so some of our most iconic structures, hedgerow systems, don't receive the love that perhaps they should have, either from us as academics studying them, but nor in terms of policy. DEFRA, I think, has one agroforestry specialist within it across, and so there's a gap there, and I think obviously what's happening globally has an influence. If we look at some of the high-profile literature coming out now, the International Panel on Climate Change produced a publication last year on land, really citing the value of agroforestry systems. This sort of profile raising is important, but also local knowledge from farmers. I come back to that. Farmers, when we think about it, they do know a huge amount about the role that trees play. I learn from farmers about livestock and trees and what they'll eat and how they'll behave. So there's a lot. It's a mixture of bottom-up systems and top-down systems, and lobbying from the parts of people like Gareth, I should imagine, and myself.
Gareth, you got anything to add to that?
I think Tim covered it quite well. I think, to be fair to Welsh Government, I'm very critical of them in certain respects, but to be fair to Welsh Government, I'm definitely not here on behalf of Welsh Government, but they have put a significant amount of funding into woodland creation recently, and I think it's up. We're putting quite a lot of pressure on them to make sure that that's available to farmers, in a way they can access, and they are looking at options for woodland management. Complete deficit really of woodland management support in Wales at the moment, other than money that we can bid into for really what are pilot projects. So I think it has to be as part of that. What they support trees on farms going forward, the new land management scheme. It needs to recognise that, as it used to. It used to be there, So, you know, but I think that voice has got to come from the farmers as well, you know, and it is, you do hear it, but it's just got to get through really. But I think they are open to these things.
Well, that's a good optimistic note on what to end on, I think, and Glenda encouraging us to lobby, to continue lobbying. So thank you all very much. Thank you to Tim and Lindsay and Gareth for their presentations. Thank you to Jane and the team for the conference, which is fantastic. Thanks also to Clive moderating in the background. If you want to find out more information about the Fabulous Farmers project, do go either to the Fabulous Farmers website or the Soil Association website. And the Agroforestry Handbook, if you haven't downloaded a copy yet, is still available for download on the Soil Association website. So thank you very much, and thank you for attending.